Hi, everyone. This is Jen Grisanti of Jen Grisanti Inc. In this video, we are going to take a look at the first of 7 key points of the soul of story. Once you understand these 7 points, you'll better grasp on how to activate the purpose of story, character, and plot in your writing. So, the point we're going to discuss today is the first point, which is trauma points. Every film, TV show, streaming show, novel deals with trauma points in a different way. And understanding how you are going to deal with trauma in your story will help you understand how to navigate the wound and how to thread it through. So when you are considering the trauma points, you want to think about the childhood wound and the trigger event wound before we enter the story. And you want to consider which is going to be more dominant in your story. Is the childhood wound going to be more dominant, or is the trigger event wound that happens before we enter the story going to be more dominant? Then you want to consider how the inciting incident or series trigger and dilemma split open the earlier wounds, because if it is done well, then your series setup or your inciting incident in your film or novel will split open the earlier wounds, and you will develop your story from the point of the childhood wound, the trigger event wound before we enter the story, and then the inciting incident and how it splits open those wounds. I'm going to give you an example that we go through in my upcoming course, Activating the Purpose of Story, Character, and Plot from the series Dying for Sex. So in Dying for Sex, we open where we see Molly, the lead character, have a fantasy in her 20s of when she was receiving oral sex. And then we join Molly and her husband Steve at couples therapy, where we learn that their problem dilemma is that they haven't had sex in years since Molly was first diagnosed with cancer. So the trigger event wound before we enter the story is Molly's diagnosis. Then we learn about the childhood wound or earlier wound when Steve mentions that Molly has a complicated history with sex. So we recognize how the inciting incident when Molly discovers that the cancer has returned splits open those earlier wound points. So that gives you an example of how it is done in Dying for Sex. In A Real Pain, which is about two somewhat distant cousins who are planning a trip to Poland to visit the place where their grandmother lived, we feel the earlier wounds as they are a dominant part of this plot. We have the wound of the grandmother's death before we enter the story, which really fuels what the pursuit is in this film. And then we have the trauma wound, earlier wound of Benji attempting to commit suicide, which is linked to the grandmother's death. So these are the dominant earlier wounds, and they are revealed, and we find out more about Benji's attempt during the pursuit when these two cousins are going to Poland. And we also learn that the childhood wound was These two cousins were very close when they were growing up. They lived close together and they were like brothers. And since then, they have grown apart. And this trip to Poland is an opportunity for them to learn to reconnect. So, this gives you an example of how, when you understand how to write the trauma point, it can help you to activate the purpose of story, character, and plot. In my next video, you will see me discussing point number 2 in the 7 keys to writing the soul of your story. I want to thank you so much for joining me.